Okay. All right. So next up, we've got Jeff Oskamp. Jeff has 9 years of experience in coastal, marine, and ocean engineering, including planning, design, and analysis. He's experienced with numerical modeling, including coastal offshore hydrodynamics, flood analysis/assessment, and vessel mooring/berthing analyses, as well as design of coastal features such as navigation channels, dredging, beach nourishment, living shorelines, and shore protection structures. He has experience with various aspects of design of port structures, including establishing design water levels and other meta-ocean conditions, that's a new word for me, calculating mooring loads with dynamic mooring simulations, and designing fender systems. He is an active member of PIANC Marcom Working Group number 211 to update the guidance for designing fender systems. Jeff is knowledgeable about the current state of science for sea level rise, including methods for incorporating sea level rise into a probabilistic flood hazard analysis. He is a member of the ASCE COPRI Sea Level Change Task Force, contributing to the guidance for performing risk assessments. All right, thanks, Jeff.
Excellent. All right. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, well, I was going to present my, whoops, here we have, my other presentation on why coastal engineers are so cool. Was that the question? That was the top. That was going to be the topic of my presentation, but I switched that one. All right. Well, that one's pretty short. We already covered it. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about some probabilistic analysis for sea level change and highlighting a couple of projects that we've worked on as well with North Carolina Department of Transportation. So I hate word slides, so I thought I would start with one. It seemed like from yesterday, all the talks, everyone started out with some quotes, and I thought, well, I could start out with a couple of good ones, a really short one and a really long one. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. Yeah, that's pretty true for sea level change as well, right? And then this one, this is really long. I'm going to breeze through it real quick. I thought it was too good to pass up, though. The tie between near-term investment and long-term vulnerability can be seen in retrospect. In the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, about 90% of New Jersey's customers for PSE&G lost power, many for more than a week. 14 of their major switching stations were affected, and 7 of the switching stations were located in sites of generation stations and substations that had been sited prior to 1911. In other words, the siting decisions made by Thomas Alva Edison and his compatriots had a fairly direct impact on the effect of the vulnerability of the New Jersey electric grid during a storm more than a century later. And no doubt, the vulnerability of their great-grandchildren's electric grid for coastal flooding was not one of their design considerations when they made those siting decisions. But with climate change and sea level rise amplifying exposure, in some cases dramatically, it's become increasingly urgent to be more forward-looking. And I like that because it's always good to remember that we can say we have a 50-year design horizon or a 75-year design horizon, but some of the decisions we make will make a difference a lot further into the future than that. And so trying to be as forward-thinking as we can reasonably be with the resources and the decisions we make is a good thing. So I'm going to talk about, first off, some sea level rise, a little bit in general of design philosophy for how to incorporate sea level change information, and then talk about a couple of examples. So I love this slide. This has been hit a couple times yesterday, and I'm going to go over it again a little bit of the head in the sand approach that we have towards flood design currently, where we pick some sort of recurrence interval, 50-year or 100-year storm perhaps, and then we add in some margin or freeboard, and then we all kind of, I guess, pretend that we kind of know what that means, right? We don't really have any idea what the risk of flooding is for our infrastructure, because most people don't actually think in terms of how likely is the project to get wet, right? You think 100-year flood, you add in some margin, you add in some other conservative assumptions, and you never stop to ask the question. And to me, that's like sticking your head in the sand, because in a lot of cases, that's not a terribly difficult question to answer, at least at a basic level, because we have that information from the recurrence interval of the flood and from the freeboard that we're adding in, we can make an estimate of that. Why is that important? Well, because when you shift gears and when you start thinking a little bit more in terms of risk, and you start to acknowledge the uncertainties that are associated with the different parameters, you find yourself in a frame of mind that it's a lot easier to incorporate sea level change, because sea level change basically comes into your project as a change to the risk, like it's going to change over time. And if you're not thinking about your flooding in terms of risk to begin with, then thinking about how that risk evolves through time isn't really it doesn't really fit within that frame of thinking, right? So if we start thinking about floods in terms of how likely they're to occur, based on either an annual exceedance probability or maybe more helpfully, a whole life perspective of reliability, the reliability of your project with respect to flooding over its whole life, then we can start to find ourselves in a better framework for thinking about sea level change. And of course, sea level change has uncertainty baked into it from a lot of different levels. There's uncertainty with respect to the climate change scenarios, these warming scenarios that we have in emissions. There's uncertainty with respect to how those emission scenarios will work themselves out into the various mechanisms of ice melting in different regions. And as you walk forward in time, you would find that if you were to express our expectation of what the sea level might be in any given year, our bell curve is going to get flatter and wider, right? And as you go further, we have less and less confidence in knowing where the sea level will be in any given year. And if you look at this in the work of Robert Kopp and others, they provide these projections out into the future, and if you plot the probability of non-exceedance, or you could call them fractile curves, this is representing the likelihood that the sea will not be higher than each of these curves based on their colors. If you were to slice those curves with cross sections, like I'm showing there, you end up with something that looks sort of like what I showed on the previous slide, where you have bell curve shapes that get wider and flatter as you go into the future. So why is this important? Well, this is exactly what we need if we're going to start to think about flooding in the future in a probabilistic sense, because we want to have not just a stochastic model or probabilistic understanding of storm surge or other flooding mechanisms, but we want to also have a probabilistic model for sea level change, because we're not actually sure, so we're not going to just pick a certain one. We're not going to pick one curve. We're going to pick this whole model as our representation of storm surge, of sea level change for our study. And so once you decide you're going to go down that road, you can use a Monte Carlo simulation to integrate the sea level change model, this whole probabilistic model, as a stochastic model, and you can integrate that with your whatever storm surge information you might have from FEMA or from the Corps of Engineers, or if you have to propose your own study. But publicly available data is often accessible for this type of work on the coast of the United States. And so we found that we can do this sort of Monte Carlo simulation relatively straightforward. It's 100 lines of MATLAB code. That part of it is only 10 lines. So it's fairly efficient in terms of the running it, and then it's processing and making graphs and thinking about it. So what do you get out of this? Well, you get a lot of different things. You can plot the data in various different ways, but in this case, we're looking at the annual likelihood of flooding. So this would be an annual exceedance probability, essentially. And over time, it changes. And this is the best estimate based on our Monte Carlo simulation study. And at different grade levels, of course, the probability goes down. So for example, if you look at an elevation of 8, in this particular example, we have a 1% AEP. That's what we would think of as a 100-year flood. And as that progresses out, that 1% AEP is at elevation 10 in 2070. Okay, so that's nice. So we can get nice information like that. But then the question is, what do you do with that? How do you incorporate this into a design? Because ultimately, if we're thinking about risk, we have to decide how much we're going to change the design of the project and how much change in the risk we're willing to accept, or what our criteria is. So we introduced this idea of allowances. This is not an original. The term publication, I can get you the publication if you like, but there's some good publications talking about design allowances. If we think about present day risk, whatever we're either implicitly accepting as our present day risk or whatever our design standard accepts as a risk, we can start with that as our benchmark. And if we were to do nothing different, this black line would be our risk profile throughout the life of our project. It's only going to get worse, right? That's what we start with, and it gets worse. Anytime you raise the project up, you reduce the initial risk, but then throughout the life of the project, the risk also starts to increase. The question is, how much do you raise the project? Do you need to raise the project so that it follows this green line, so that at the end of the project, you've just reached back up to this initial risk threshold that you are willing to accept in present day? Or is there somewhere in the middle that we can say, on average, we accept the risk, right? Later in the project, the risk is higher. Sooner in the project, the risk is lower. But in terms of the whole reliability of the system, in terms of the whole life of the system, the likelihood of flooding, we can accept this average risk. Now, this is stated purely in terms of flooding reaching a threshold. There's a lot of ways you can slice and dice this. You can annualize this into costs and think about it in terms of net present value and say, well, if this is later on, then that has a different net present worth. And so you can do this in terms of cost-benefit analysis, and you can look at it a lot of different ways. But just in terms of a straight-up probability of occurrence, you can tell there's not a single right answer on how to incorporate that. There's a couple different ways of looking at it. So if you think about it, the instantaneous allowance, going back to the data set we presented a couple slides ago, if you take that 1% annual exceedance at elevation 8 and you say, all right, well, we have a 50-year design life and we want to never have more than a 1% annual exceedance flood level. So we would raise our project 2 feet to elevation 10, approximately would be the value, and then we could say we've incorporated sea level change to the best of our ability based on this analysis, and we're expecting that we will not have more than a 1% AEP during the project life. If we look at it from a design life allowance, that's the average or a whole life perspective, we could say that under current situation, we have approximately a 40% chance that during our project life, we would be flooded at least once. Okay, that's 40% chance under the no sea level rise scenario. So if business as usual and the sea's not rising, this is what our current risk tolerance would equate to in terms of whole life flooding risk. Now, since we know that the sea is rising, we can look at a couple different scenarios here. There's RCP 4.5. If we go to RCP 8.5, that's the higher emission scenario. We would find that our 40% risk tolerance here would put us in between 8.5 and 9. So maybe we raise the project 1 foot to account for sea level rise. 2 different ways of thinking about it, both ways that you could say have some credibility in terms of establishing a design basis for why you picked the number you picked. And depending on the risk tolerance in the project, you could go with one perspective or make an argument that the other is more appropriate. I'm going to hit a couple of case studies here pretty quick. The first one is North Carolina Highway 24 in Swansboro, North Carolina. It's there's 2 bridges here that go across this low-lying area, and I think I dropped my other image off there by accident. But you can see those bridges there, and we were looking at this as part of a pilot project for the NCHRP 1561 pilot project, and our objective there was to help establish the design basis for flooding and waves for future improvements in this area. So we started out looking at local sea level change based on the available guidance. We looked at the North Carolina guidance, which had some very helpful information about the subsidence in the different coastal zones in the area and the different tidal stations. And we looked at the probabilistic models that were available for sea level change. We can incorporate those into our analysis. For storm surge, we have the most recent FEMA study that we were able to extract data at points close to our location for a hazard curve. We also performed our own coastal hydrodynamic analysis because the nonlinear effects were of interest to us. We wanted to know that when the storm surges propagate through this area on a higher water level, if this under future sea level rise conditions, how different where the storm surges events occur. Because in simplistic terms, a lot of people will just add the sea level rise to the storm surge, and that's not horrible in a lot of cases. I mean, it's a start, right? But it's not apparently obvious that it just adds. And in some cases, there could be a meaningful difference. And so we performed a range of modeling scenarios here. You can see we did this is a little small print on the bottom there. Anyway, we did incremental sea level rise cases where we looked at 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 feet of sea level rise. And then we ran through a range of storm surge events on top of that and looked at the nonlinear effect, basically how much different was this storm event when it happened on 2 or 3 feet of sea level rise versus just at present day sea level. And we were able to construct an interpolation function that we could use as a surrogate model in our Monte Carlo simulation, which is just a fancy way of saying that we could incorporate it really fast in the model so that every time we're iterating through, we don't have to rerun our coastal hydrodynamic model. It's just calculating a polynomial fit for it so that we can do that for 1 million simulations in a matter of a few seconds instead of a few years of computer time. Because 1 million simulations takes a long time on a coastal model. So we did a similar thing with waves to be able to look at the nonlinear effects with waves and sea level rise, and we're able to quantify that, which was very helpful. We found that in terms of waves, we were looking at 5 to 10% difference in the wave heights over what could be a credible range of sea level changes. So based on these inputs, we pulled the storm surge hazard curve. This is a bit of an eye chart. It's just the main word is Monte Carlo simulation. So yeah, we pulled our model for probabilistic sea level change and our model for storm surge and ran through what would be essentially millions of simulations. And when I say a simulation, I mean it's an artificially generated data set that is a potential realization of the next 80 or 100 years. And by realization, I mean it is storm surge events, the largest storm surge event that would happen in each year for that time period, plus the sea level change that's associated with that, all modified by the nonlinear effects factor. And so once we have this data set, we've essentially said, here's a possibility of how the next 100 years will unfold, and here's 1 million possibilities of how the next 100 years will unfold. And once you take those together, each of those possibilities is equally probable in terms of our probability space here. So you can rank them and sort them and plot statistics based on them and say what's more and less likely to occur. So you can do all kinds of cool stuff with that and make graphics that might or might not be easy to understand. So sometimes I spend a lot of time trying to explain them. Anyway, here's one that I like. This is talking about how the probability of flooding one or more times during a project life would evolve for various project lifetimes. And what this means is you can go down as you raise the project, and then as you go out into the future, you can look at the cumulative or the whole life probability that you'll receive at least one flood. And this is the way I think it's so helpful to think about flooding, because I really think we miss something when we try to think only in terms of annualized flooding and we don't actually think about how likely it is for it to happen during the life of the project. So the value of this is cool, looking at it in and of itself, but the real value of these is comparing them. When you start to look at the difference between what would happen if there wasn't any sea level rise and then what would happen if there is sea level rise. And so you can look at any given one, like in the several slides back where we were comparing different benchmark levels. In this case, an elevation of 9 at a 60-year project life, you have about a 70% chance of flooding. If you wanted to achieve a similar result with sea level rise in a 60-year project, you're looking at elevation 10. So we're talking about a 1 foot difference in grade level to achieve that. Okay, real quick, I'm gonna hit on my second case study here. Alligator River Bridge. This is a long bridge crossing the Alligator River. low-lying areas on both sides. We wanted to look at what the low chord elevation might be to help with the design basis for this project. I'm going to skip all the upfront stuff because it's very similar to the previous one, looking at the sea level change inputs and storm surge inputs. We ran through the same type of Monte Carlo simulation analysis there. And what I wanted to just hit on real quick for this example was the interpretation of results. Because when you start talking about 5%, 10%, 20%, or 70% chance of flooding once in a project life, those numbers are hard to relate to because that's not how we're used to thinking about flooding, right? If you tell someone a 100-year flood, they say, okay, cool, and somehow we think we know what that means, but because we always hear it and we're okay with it. But if you tell someone there's a 50% chance that they're gonna get flooded, they might not be okay with that. But more importantly, we don't know if we're okay with that because we don't really think that way, right? So we say, oh, 50% chance, that kind of sounds bad, but I don't really know, is that good or bad? So we tried to benchmark this. We wanted to know, how does this relate to what we would get if we just looked at, like, say, the 500-year flood over our project life? So with sea level change, 100 years, this is with the moderate emission scenario, RCP 4.5. We said if we picked an elevation 8, we'd have about a 10% chance of flooding in our project life. If we bump that up to the higher emission scenario, we would have about a 21% chance of flooding during our project life. And then we wanted to compare that to just the straight up statistics for what does a 500-year flood look like over a 100-year life. This is not related to our project at all. This is just a matter of how a Poisson process works in statistics, right? If you have a process and you have a 500-year return period, over a 100-year period, you have about an 18% chance of flooding. So we looked at this, we had a 9.5 or 10% chance under the moderate emission scenario. We had a 21% chance under the higher emission scenario, and we said, we're right there. We're right there at about 20%, and that's what we would have got if we just designed it for a 500-year flood under our current design philosophy. So we can live with that. So that was kind of the thought process, is we're going to try to benchmark it back to what we would get if we just designed for a 500-year flood without sea level change. In summary, we looked at a couple different things here. Definitely with sea level rise, we have to deal with changing conditions with respect to time and a significant amount of uncertainty about what those conditions will be. I think probabilistic methods are pretty well suited to help to interpret and communicate these effects and to analyze them well. And we looked at some different example projects to show how those can be practically applied with Monte Carlo simulation and using surrogate models for the nonlinear effects. Any questions? We have time for questions? Okay. Mm-hmm.
Would you find value in using some of those data points that they've done? They essentially did a similar thing on a larger scale. Right?
Yes, that's one of the databases that you can get the NACS study and the other studies, yes. And so that was on one of those slides early on. I was showing the storm surge hazard curve, which that's one of the sources of information you could get. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So when you're doing this, you're not, and you said this pretty much, you're not running ASTER at the same time. Right?
Nope. Nope.
How are you estimating those extreme events? What exactly are you doing?
The surge levels that when I generate that, so that the generating the surge levels themselves is merely just sampling from a probability distribution function. It would be based on NACS or FEMA or something else. So, yeah.
So when they run NACS, these close models, you're at the storm set.
Yeah.
So
Yep. Yes, yes, yeah, because to go back and do that again I mean, it's definitely doable, it's just a monumental task, so.
That step had to take place.
Yes, you have to have some estimate of the probability for the surge events, even if it's just a few points, then you try to interpolate between them or something, but you do have, based on this, otherwise, yeah, you have to have something to go on. I will say one other comment on that is for one of the projects we did for North Carolina DOT was inside the sound there in North Carolina, and we did our own, I think at least part of the analysis was based on our own extreme value analysis for water levels. So certainly if you have water level data and you're comfortable with the length of record and you're willing, you can do an extreme value analysis off of your local water levels. So this exact, no, we didn't publish a paper for this conference. I don't believe they take papers for this conference. So, so no, it probably will at some point, but haven't. So, okay. Mm-hmm.
Which I guess applies, at some level. And I guess maybe this is for you and for everybody. What do people think? Is that a reasonable way to think about dealing with a changing future? Does it make sense to discount?
Oh.
In general, as far as something we might figure out a better way to deal with things in the future, and so maybe we don't need to worry about those risks as much, or
yeah, and we did a similar approach for a marine terminal up in Baltimore, and they were concerned about loss of cargo, and so we discounted the loss of cargo out, looking at what the cargo might be in the future and what might cost them in damages if they didn't protect their cargo from future flooding. And so we were able to basically tie each flooding event that could happen in the future to a dollar value of cargo damage that would likely happen, and then discount that into present day dollars to be able to compare the value of different flood mitigation alternatives. So yeah, certainly in some cases it might be a gross oversimplification, but from a business perspective you might want to at least try to put some dollars on it to figure out how to compare alternatives. So, Johnny.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing that out of this topic analysis too that you see is people will immediately start thinking about what they can live with the risk now and start looking at adaptation pathways in the future and how they might have to change things over time if they want to live with the same risk. So there's some of the value that comes out of this. And the other thing that Jeff talked about too, that I'd like to say about this is that it accounts for just about a little bit of top and everything we believe in. We're seeing otherwise projections, that's in there. If we believe in higher, it's in there. So we're trying to really, the purpose of this is to add reduce the amount of uncertainty in your decision making. So I think a little bit more certainty to the uncertainty.
Maybe moderate too, and not, we don't want to be grossly over conservative. And like you said, if we go back to that slide with the allowances, if you put in 6 feet of allowance for sea level change, then you find that your present day risk went down astronomically low to the point where it's almost absurd. You say, was that do we need it to be that low now, or could we do something over time, like Johnny said, where you say, we'll reduce the risk now, and then maybe we'll have something baked into the design where we can reduce it more later or something. Mm-hmm.
Coastal engineers tend to do a lot of work with harbors or dredging and things like that. Transportation is not your primary source of funding. What was at least from what I've seen, what was your experience working with the transportation agency compared to some of the other agencies that you know?
He's sitting right there, so I can't say anything bad. It was fantastic. I mean, I showed up, so. I don't know if I have a lot of comment on. I mean, I like on the technical side of things. So I love the work is great. I mean, so in terms of the nuts and bolts, what we did is probably fairly similar to what we would have done for a private client. And I mean, obviously it can be way more involved. It could be way more involved for a transportation project. It's just this was the level of study we did for this. So.